It was noontime today in the center of Beijing when a man walked to the middle of the Avenue of Eternal Peace.
Well, all right. Welcome back to the Survival and Basic Badass Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a badass of history. We're talking about Bass Reeves. Now, I actually didn't even really know about Bass Reeves. We kind of reached out to the audience to make suggestions and comments on who would be, the right guy, and I got actually several recommendations for Bass Reeves. So, I was like, oh, I better dig into this. And turns out, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. Kevin, what do you know about this guy?
Yeah, well, I didn't know anything about him either until I started looking him up and reading about him. Definitely an interesting dude. Born a slave, first black deputy. Was he a deputy marshal?
I don't know about the first one, but he was one of the first. Let's go with that.
All right.
The first one, I think, is a stretch. Go on.
Yeah. So he was born in Texas before Texas. Well, he was born in Arkansas, but as a baby, was
really
moved to Texas.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, it was Paris, Texas, is where he was. Where he escaped from. Basically, he was born a slave, and there's a lot of different stories about how he stopped being a slave. But basically, he asked his master George Reeves if he could like learn or read and write, and he said, "I'm going to teach you something better. I'm going to teach you how to handle a gun."
Yes.
And so he would practice like day and night with him, and he taught himself to be ambidextrous, so he could use both his hands. He always carried two Colt revolvers later on, and used both of them just as easily. And then at some point, it's probably likely that he got into a argument over cards with George Reeves and knocked him unconscious, and then just took off. Maybe stole his horse, maybe didn't, but he took off and went out to the Indian territories.
All right. So went out to the Indian territories. Now that's a thing. So what it was basically the land that was given to the Indians, the territory at the time, the federal government had no jurisdiction over. So basically, if you were a slave, they couldn't and wouldn't come get you if you hung out with the Indians. So that was the thing. So a lot of criminals and a lot of former slaves all kind of migrated to this Indian territory.
Right, where there's no U.S. law.
Right.
Yeah.
And the upside to that is, one, he learned the territory, but two, he learned to speak he learned to communicate with the 5 different tribes, whether that's different dialects or 5 distinct languages, whatever. I don't know. I wasn't there. But bottom line, he, learned to communicate with all the Indians. And that was a big thing because it's going to play out later. Now, he then finds a wife, Jenny Nellie. Or Nellie Jenny, sorry.
Right.
Nellie Jenny marries her and later goes on to have, I think it's 11 babies. Now, I actually heard 9 sometimes, and I heard 11 sometimes. I think once you get after 5, like, how do you even remember anymore?
Right. You can't even keep track of that.
Yeah. That's that's how that stuff goes. But so once he left the Indian territory, he actually set up a farm and was a farmer for about 30 years. And they say quite a successful farmer, and ended up owning a decent amount of land and a decent amount of stuff. So he was kind of doing all right, just doing that.
Right.
But then where's the turn? Where's the twist?
Well, he kind of was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger in a lot of these stories, right? But he ended up going to work for a guy named Judge Isaac Parker. Now, Isaac Parker was also known as the hanging judge because he had hung 6 people all on the same day and got the name after that and kind of just kept going with it. So a lot of these guys that Bass Reeves went out after were like, if they got captured and went to jail, they were getting hung. They knew that. Like, it wasn't, it wasn't like, oh, all right, well, I'll go serve my time and
Right.
wrap it up.
But that's the thing, though. This is where the hardened criminals go. This isn't the guy who snuck the pack of gum out of the,
Right.
out of, right? He
Yeah.
saw the gum at the end of the counter and took it out of the display. Now it's not like that. These are guys who are like, fuck the law and I'm going to do what I want. This is
Right.
the kid types, right? The crazies.
Right. Right. And you always hear about, I don't know what the deal is, but you never hear about Bass Reeves, but you always hear about Billy the Kid and Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok. For some reason, they're all named Bill. But all the Bills you hear about, you don't hear about the Basses.
Well, Bass is still a B name, so you have a theme. All right. But I think so. Part of that, right, is because he's a former slave and they didn't read and write. Right. That's the thing.
Right. And, he kind of got his start. What he was doing was whiskey smugglers.
Well,
he was after the whiskey stuff. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just going to say that. So with a lot of these guys, the reason they live in infamy, Billy the Kid and whatever, either somebody takes a shine to them and is writing stories about them, or they're writing their own story. Remember there was that, what is it, Wild Bill Hickok, or one of them had that like traveling road show about, hey, I was a badass.
Right.
A road show about it,
right.
or whatever. And they, Calamity Jane and all them, they hung out and whatever. So that's the thing. Promotion kind of helps you live in infamy. And I don't think Bass Reeves was that guy. He kind of came across as the humble and, a little more reserved guy. But like you said, so there was one of the things, the Indian territory, alcohol was illegal.
Right.
So, or whiskey was illegal. I don't know about alcohol in general. So I assume that's kind of the go-to. But so what happened?
Well, he got good at figuring out where these guys were traveling. Because you wouldn't travel on the main roads. You try and take alternate routes to get out there. When you're smuggling things, you don't go through all the checkpoints and the towns and everything, right? So he first started figuring out what roads they were traveling on and wait for him. But he kept nailing all these guys. But you're getting 3 or 4 barrels of whiskey at a time. You're not solving a problem. It's like sticking a finger in a dike. So he so he started figuring out who is making it and where they're actually crossing the river and distributing it to different smugglers. And so Judge Parker got him. The thing with Bass Reeves is he always worked alone or with one like posseman. He just hires some guy that knew that area.
And that kind of fits the whole
travel around
thing. Right. I got to say, a lot of the marshals, that was kind of the MO, was they would have like a tracker, a guide with them, just somebody kind of who was familiar with the area, even though, mind you, that's where he started out as that guy kind of thing.
Right.
And could speak the languages and navigate with the Indians. But then they would travel with a wagon, a cook, and a tracker. Now the cook's going to come into play later, but so anyway, so he would have a guy with him, and so what happens?
And so then they started making big busts, like the guys that were actually producing the whiskey or buying the whiskey to sell it out, and actually like started putting a dent in these big whiskey operations, smuggling operations. It's basically like catching up with the head of the mob or catching the head of the cartel. But this pissed a lot of people off. So they started sending him out further and further with more and more warrants, right, at a time. And he couldn't read or write. He was never learned how to read or write. So he would take like stacks of 15, 20 warrants, and he would have to just memorize in order the names that were on there, so that if he, caught up with somebody, he could take like 1 out of, 6 down. That's this guy, So he had a really good memory. but had never learned to read or write. And that was probably part of the reason why a lot of the stories are unknown.
Unknown, right?
Right.
Now, he did have a trick for figuring out the warrants, though, too. That he kind of now Bass Reeves they said that he liked disguises,
Right.
and it's funny. People think he likes the different dressing up as whatever, but basically he would. It was pretty much, and I think that's where people tie the Lone Ranger and the mask. It
Hmm.
kind of comes into play.
Right.
But I think where it kind of comes from, like he would be, like one, it seemed like if anybody ever asked him, "Hey, are you Bass Reeves?" He was always like, "No, no, I'm
Yeah.
not that guy."
Yeah.
And
He
that's
wasn't the
like,
guy that walked into the casino and like
right.
Bond, James
That's his
Bond.
master of disguise, though, as far as I could tell. Like
Yeah.
they said that he would act like a homeless drunk guy and he would
Right.
just kind of lay there, in the
Or
bar and
a
whatever.
poor like outlaw, and he would fall in with groups of outlaws
Right.
and
And
then
just
figure out
kind of
who
mix
everybody
in.
was and put them under
Right.
arrest. Yeah.
And there's a couple stories that'll, we'll kind of talk about that kind of will dictate or, explain that a little bit further. But yeah, he used to, kind of be a little sneaky. But anyway, what I was going to say is one of his MOs was he would hand people their own warrant and he would be like, "Hey, I can't read. Can you read this to me?"
Hmm.
And they would look at the paper and either start reading it or just stare at it. And while they're looking at it, he would get the drop on them.
Hmm.
And being like quick draw guy and, his MO, he'd really get the jump on a lot of people just through that technique.
Yeah.
So that was one of the, I don't know that he needed the help reading the warrant. I'm sure he didn't because like
Hmm.
we said, good memory, memorized, and I'm sure they were like hand drawn pictures at the time, but
Right.
whatever.
Right. Yeah. Another thing that kind of shows how quick he was with the quick draw, which a lot of that stuff, a lot of those stories from the Wild West about quick draws and shit, that's all kind of bullshit. But he really was quick with his revolvers. He had 2 Colt revolvers that he always carried with him, and a Remington rifle. And he was out riding looking for a couple of guys that he had warrants for, and 3 guys that were wanted for stealing horses and were involved in a lot of missing people. He didn't have warrants for him, but they thought he was coming after them, so they waited for him. And when he came up through the trail, they all jumped out and had him dead to rights. And they had him, put his hands up and get off his horse and, not go near his Colt revolver. So he got down off his horse and he asked him if any of them had a pencil so that he could write the date that he captured him.
Smart.
And they started laughing and he shot all 3 of them before they got him.
Hey, that's it.
Mhm.
That's part of his trick. Yeah, there was another one later in his career. He's going down the road and the 2 guys kind of ran up with him and they're like, "Hey, we think you're Bass Reeves and we think you might be looking for us." And he's like, "No, no, I'm not that guy. That's not me."
Mhm.
And they were like, "No, really, we're pretty sure. We're gonna, you know what? You're coming with us." And they put him on the horse and they said, "We're gonna take you into town and we're gonna find out, who you are, and we're gonna get you." And they start going into town and hoping to come across somebody, and they don't find anybody. And they're like, "You know what? We're tired of carrying this guy." I believe they use some inappropriate language that you would use, is how I read the story. But
Right.
anyway, so they go on and they're like, "You know what, dude? We're just going to kill you because we don't have time for this. Do you have any last requests? Because we're just going to shoot you in the head." And he's like, "Well, you know what? I do have this letter in my bag from my wife and I can't read and everything. It would be awesome if you could read it to me before I die. So at least I can be thinking of her." And that's
Mhm.
there was a little interpretation embellishment there in my part, but that was the gist of it. And so the way it works, they take the letter and they start reading it or looking at it, and sure enough, gets the drop on them and is like, "Oh, you forgot to check if I had a gun." Or
Yeah.
actually, the way I think I remember it is he actually took it. He had big hands. He's a big guy. He's 6'2",
Yeah.
185.
Yeah. He was a big dude
He
for that
reached
time and
out
place.
he grabbed the dude's throat. He starts choking him with both hands. It's the way I read it. Then holds his neck with one hand, reaches and grabs the guy's pistol and shoots the second guy with the pistol, and then takes the one in. It is how I read the story. So I'm just saying, over and over again. There was another story where he was after two brothers and he knew they were hanging out at their mom's place. Do you have this story?
No.
No. All right.
I haven't
So
heard
they were
this one.
hanging out at their mom's place and he knew where that was, but he couldn't find the guys and he didn't see them around. So he kind of dirtied himself up. He actually left his wagon and his posse guy. And it was like a 20-mile hike. I don't know why, you needed to be so far away, but that was the play. And he walks in and he goes in and he's like, hey, I'm a thug and a criminal to the mom. And, I'm just looking for somewhere to eat. Cause that's always how you introduce yourself when you're a criminal. You're like, hey,
I'm a
and
criminal.
she's like, oh, guess what? This is so weird. My two sons are thugs and criminals. You guys should meet. You'll probably like each other. And he's like, that sounds great. Why don't you introduce us? So sure enough, they come home later that day and they start drinking and hanging out and they're best of buddies. And they're like, yeah, let's do thug criminal stuff together. And he's like, this is a great idea. Let's do that. So somehow he gets to sleep in the bed and they both sleep on the floor. I'm not sure how that works, but they were like, yeah, you know what? Take the bed. You're a good guy, whatever. He gets up in the night, handcuffs them both without them noticing. And I imagine these are like the old school, bars through the,
right.
Click,
Yeah,
and,
you got to weld it shut.
Right. He sets them up, gets them both handcuffed. And then the way I was told the story, they wake up handcuffed and are surprised. But he probably just, gave him a boot to the back of the head and was like, hey.
Yeah.
And then, so they jump up and he's like, you're coming with me. Walks them back to the wagon, ties them up. They said sometimes he'd have 13 people up to even 17 people, I read, chained one to the next, behind his wagon and just following them around. So
yeah, they said he captured over 3,000 criminals.
And that was the way I read that one. Because the numbers, you don't know.
They
but
seem
somebody
crazy,
did
right?
a newspaper article about him about 5 years before he retired from the Marshal Service. And at that point, he said that he had done over 3,000 arrests is where they were at. But, those are impressive numbers,
Right. The thing was, like this area where there are hardly any, white people. This area was like, it was like your hometown. You know what I mean? He knew everybody. He had spent his whole, not his whole life, but a big portion of his life in this area. And he knew everybody. He had a lot of informants. He had, and he would go from town to town and he knew people in every town there. He was a well-known person in that area. And so, when it goes to like disguises and stuff, people don't have pictures, they remember, the black dude with a wild mustache. That's about it. That's about it. Yeah.
He's got he's got the Tom Selleck mustache. He's 6'2". Actually, I think, he'd even put Tom Selleck to shame, but he had an impressive
it was better than Tom Selleck. I'd definitely say that. It was right up there with the pictures you see of Doc Holliday and those guys,
Actually,
those
big
handlebar mustaches.
that's the thing. I mean, I think these guys in history, they always had the impressive look, I think this guy, you see the picture. I feel like if we needed somebody to play him, he's like your Will Smith type, right?
Yeah.
Is that where we'd go? I mean, he's an impressive guy. I don't know. But so anyway, so now he did have like, you got any more stories of the arrests, anything like that?
Well, there was a famous story where he was out with the posse, chasing these guys. They're out in this big field, right? And they started shooting at him, and they kept missing him because he was like, he was like a quarter mile away. And so the sheriff asked the Marshall Reeves because he was so famous with his
The
sharpshooting.
go-to shooter, right?
Right. And he said, I'm going to break his neck. And from a quarter mile away, shot him right through the back of his neck with his
Nice.
rifle.
And that's the thing. Now you got to remember, we're not talking about a scoped rifle.
Right. These are iron sights, you know?
Iron sights on your old Winchesters. So you
Right.
imagine your dad's or maybe your Winchester 30-30.
Mm-hmm.
And, actually I believe I wrote it down. He had a favorite caliber, and you'd actually be impressed to know it was 38-40 Colt. But why you'd be impressed is he would use the same rounds for his handgun and his rifle. So using a handgun round in your rifle, a lot of times you have a little bit less powder going on there. So it's not as great for those long shots. You actually have to do some calculation.
Right.
Because you don't
right.
have such a big powder load and you have a decent size, bullet. So that's impressive. I did hear, now I heard multiple stories, and we're going to get into this in a minute, of how he may have had different rounds for his rifle and his pistol, and there were some loading issues, but we're going to get into that.
Mm-hmm.
But at least later on in his career, he did 38-40 Colt, and he would do the same rounds for both. And it could be because of this incident that he actually switched to the same round for both, so there wouldn't be any confusion. Just saying, that might be a thing. We're gonna get into it. That's a tease, if you will. So anyway, he the way I heard that story is it was actually a guy, Webb, that they had arrested. The guy was kind of a dirtbag. The story was that his neighbor was a preacher, and I believe an African American, and he was burning his field to clear the land, basically. And the fire got a little bit out of hand and burned somehow into this other guy's land. Or actually, he was like, this Webb guy was like a farm manager for the property next door, and some of the land got damaged. So he went over to retaliate against the preacher. What the hell are you doing? You idiot. You ruined, our stuff. How dare you? You need to be more responsible. I took a little liberty there. So anyway, and he ends up shooting the guy. So they put out an arrest warrant for this other guy. And, Bass Reeves, being the lawman that he is, I'm going to go out, handle it. Goes, grabs the guy, brings him in, no problem. Puts him in jail. The guy makes bail. Now check this out. $17,000. And this is in, I think, 1902.
Right.
And $17,000 bail. So that's impressive. A store owner ends up making the bail for him. So he ends up, takes off. Sure enough, court date comes. Guy never shows up. So, like Dog the Bounty Hunter, Bass Reeves is like, nope, not on my watch. I'm going to go get him. So him and this posse you're describing go, they kick in the store because they're like, you know what? The guy who's got the 17 grand, he's going to know. I'm going to go talk to him. That's we always see on these shows, right? They go talk to the guy who paid the bail. So sure enough, somebody sees him run out the back. And that's where Bass Reeves steps up. Hang on, 500 yards, no problem. I got this. Next shot, and hey, that's how you do it sometimes. When you're a badass, that's how you play the game.
Yep. So let's so eventually Bass Reeves is charged with murder, right?
Ooh, how did that happen? That's a little scandalous.
Right, little scandalous. So there's like 15 different stories I heard about what happened.
Now
nobody really knows what actually happened.
Right. There is no truth because the truth passed with Bass Reeves, I guess. It's accused of killing his cook, William Leach.
Right.
Now,
so
yeah, go ahead.
There are rumors that they had been in several arguments because his cooking was so bad that he kept making people sick. And there's also rumors that Bass Reeves was just cleaning his rifle. Right. A cartridge was stuck in there. right?
That's so
Still.
that's what I heard. Now at now one I heard he was cleaning his rifle. That was one
Mm-hmm.
version. Another version was he he had different rounds for his handgun and his rifle. This is what I was talking about earlier. And he loaded in the wrong round and it was kind of stuck in there. And he
Right.
was trying to get it out. And while he was distracted with that, it fired and shot his cook in the neck. Now that sounds more like the gun's kind of going to blow up on you and make more problems.
Right.
It
Right.
doesn't
If
sound
you're
like that would accidentally shoot him in the neck, but I'm
Yeah. If
told that's the
you have it
version he
open
gave in
and you've
court.
got a hand knife, a knife with your hand on it in the chamber with the round, I feel like you'd have a pretty fucked up hand if that went off.
Or maybe some powder burns on your face, when you're in
Right.
there, kind of something, right?
Right.
But your mustache might get a little singed, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Right.
deal was, right, all his prisoners were like, yep, he's a murderer, he did it. Yep, all the prisoners.
Right.
Now, I heard so many different versions of this. One was a prisoner's wife was with him because the guy had some kind of intestinal distress,
Mm-hmm.
and his wife came along to help him out as they were traveling home. And she, in one version I heard, supported Bass Reeves and was like, nope, I was outside. I wasn't locked up like the other guys. I saw it and he's totally innocent. Another version I heard was, yep, I was outside. I saw it and he totally murdered that guy.
Mm-hmm.
So, whatever. But the thing was, he ended up being in jail for, again, I heard anywhere from 3 months to a year awaiting trial.
Right.
And he
With the criminals that he had put in the jail.
Right. And this was not like a happy jail. This jail was the basement of the courthouse where for a bathroom, they would stick a pot in the unused fireplace. So, it gets a little hairy down there.
Yeah.
And they said somewhere up to 60 prisoners, stuck in there. So it's not a happy time.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, the judge liked him and the judge was like, you know what? You're a good guy. I believe your story. And I don't really know. Now, there were other rumors that Bass really liked puppies.
Right.
Did you hear this? Right.
I heard this story too.
So, right. So there was a rumor that the cook was tired of the puppy always being a beggar. Now,
Right.
You've had dogs that are beggars and it might irritate you. Some people do get irritated with that. And you're like, look, I'm tired of this dog always whining and whatever. So the rumor was that the guy actually poured hot grease from the cooking down the dog's throat because he was begging, waiting for.
Mm-hmm.
And Bass was like, we'll have none of that shit. Shot him in the neck.
Mm-hmm.
That's a rumor.
Right.
There was also another story that fits the puppy friendly guy of he found a guy beating a mother dog who just had puppies and he ended up like taking the puppies away from him and bringing them into town and even kept one as his own, very possibly the same dog that was in this story.
Yeah. So this isn't the tradition where the cops got their
shooting dogs.
Their go-to of shooting dogs.
The exact opposite.
Yeah,
right.
He's the opposite one.
He's the opposite.
He's the one that shot you if you fuck with dogs.
There you go. Exactly. So, again, all that, nobody was there. But the bottom line, we know that courts are never wrong. And they decided that it was a gun cleaning incident. So obviously that's what happened.
Right.
And we're going to leave that to history. History's told by the winners. So there you go.
Right.
Bass comes out on top. Now, we also had, we mentioned 11 kids. Now, these kids had issue after issue, but when you have 11, I feel like, you're bound to have some issues.
Yeah.
A lot of them died very young.
Especially if you're Bass Reeves, because according to everything, he might have been a cool dude, but he was also a mean motherfucker. He had like serious PTSD type symptoms. He was mean as shit. So, I mean, sometimes you got a nasty ass dad and you become a nasty ass person.
There's rumors. So he did have a daughter die from epilepsy. He had a son he lost to pneumonia. He he had no there's a famous story that we're going to talk about here about his son ended up murdering his wife, but he had another son that actually had a girlfriend and he slit her throat.
Oof.
So,
Can't
you
you
know,
just
multiple.
shake a woman? You know, you don't have to
Is
slit
that
her
what you do?
throat. Jesus, just
Yeah,
shake them.
that's I don't think that's appropriate. I think that's actually the exact opposite of what you're
All
supposed to
right.
do.
Well, I'm saying, I mean, if you have the choice between the two, you know.
All right, we'll give you that. So then, what ends up happening is, I don't know. So anyway, he has a second son or another son, and this one ends up um, having a wife who cheats on him.
Mm-hmm.
And when she cheats on him, he's like, you know what? I'm out of town all the time with my job, and I guess I understand how this could have happened. And you know what? I'm going to forgive you. I don't like it, but maybe if I just beat you around a little bit, we'll call it good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, all right, that sounds right. I'm not sure that's exactly the wording, but that's how I imagine it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then they he quits his job, or he quits that job, and he gets
Mm-hmm.
another job where he's going to be around in a local boy.
Right.
And he ends up coming home, and sure enough, there she is cheating with another guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, that's it. You know what? I'm going to have to shoot you in the face. And maybe it was the neck. I don't know. He shoots her and kills her. And Bass is out doing Bass Reeves Marshall stuff. And he comes home and everybody's like, hey, there's a warrant for your son. None of us wanted to serve it because we respect you. And basically, we don't want to cross you because that would be bad for us.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's got to be dealt with. And he's like, you know what? I got this. I'll go bring him in. And the son had gone actually in the Indian country. And there was even rumors that he even tried to kill himself, the son,
Mm-hmm.
and ended up with a scalp wound. And, he like tried to shoot himself in the head or something, but it didn't, it just
Didn't
ended
take.
bad.
Yeah.
But he ends up going to prison and, Bass brings him in, gets sentenced to life.
Mm-hmm.
But they said that he was a model citizen in prison. I don't know how with the herd of guys, maybe prison got better. He actually went to Leavenworth, the son.
Right.
And he goes to prison and 11 years later does get his sentence commuted and ends up becoming a barber. And, everything kind of works out. But that's actually after Bass has passed on.
Mm-hmm.
So he never gets to see his son freed from prison. And, but
Right.
anyway.
But one of the rumors that I heard is that his son asked his dad what he
Yes.
should do. And his Bass was like, I don't know. I think I'd kill the bitch. And then later turns out,
I heard I would shoot. I heard that it was I would shoot the guy and I would beat her. Is what they said that
Oh, so he didn't take his dad's advice. Then.
No, he completely went the opposite way. Now, mind you, both options would have landed him in prison.
Right.
But
I mean, I feel like in the grand scheme of things, if your wife cheats on you, that's on her. That's not on the dude, you know?
Yeah. That's bad. Yeah, I mean it does fall on her, but yeah, I understand. I actually had a customer when I used to do like in-home repairs, and I had a customer who ended up he was a doctor, a veterinary doctor, and I knew him, and I was like, hey, so how'd you get into being a veterinarian? He's like, oh, I learned in prison. And actually, that's where Bass Reeves' son learned in prison to be a barber.
To be a barber, right?
Right. But he's like, yeah, I learned in prison, and I'm like, you went to prison? And he's like, yeah, I came home one day and my wife was cheating on me, and I ended up shooting her. But she was like in front of the guy going, oh no, don't shoot him. And he shot through her and him, killed them both.
Oh, shit.
And yeah, went to prison, apparently got his veterinary license, and things were nothing but looking up.
Yeah, things worked out.
It worked out. I knew him till he was like well into his 80s, and he was pretty happy still running the whole, I take care of horses thing. And all good. And his wife was out spending money. The new
Mhm.
one. And I'm
The
guessing
new
she
one.
didn't cheat on.
Yeah, no, no.
I don't think, but hey, who knows? Yeah, that's a little off topic. Sorry. I get distracted.
That stuff happens. I mean, we all got to deal with those situations in our own way, you know?
Now, I think those are my great stories. I have a few other little ones, but I think that's the
Yeah. So, regardless,
yes.
um, Bass Reeves continued to be a deputy marshal for
Oh, yes,
for
I
what
do
was
have
it,
more.
about
Right.
50 years,
30
right?
years.
30
I thought it
years.
was 30
Long time.
because he started at 30, and I think he was a marshal till about 65, and they ended up Oklahoma became a U.S.
Right.
territory instead of the Indian
Yeah. So it
territory.
was 1907 that
Yes.
Oklahoma became was it became a state or
I
became,
I
yeah,
don't
got its statehood.
I
Yeah, 1907 Oklahoma became a state. There was no more needs for marshals. So he just stayed in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which was, like the outlaw town that he was hanging around most of the
right.
time, and became a police officer and
And
was a
he did
police
that for
officer
2
for,
years.
right, 2 more years.
All right.
Yep.
Now, they said he used to walk around with a cane as a police officer,
Hmm.
and the cool one that I heard is he actually had a guy follow him around with a bag. They said a handbag or a
Yes.
satchel full of guns just in
Right.
case, because you're
Right.
like, I might
He
need
had a
some
he
more.
had a sidekick that just carried a bag of guns around.
You never know, right?
That's
So
that's some
he
badass
had
shit.
he had a holster, a shoulder like underarm holster,
Right.
and he had the handgun on his side, and he had the guy with his satchel of extra guns, because you never know when you have to whip somebody.
Right. Right.
Now, what's some of the messed up things about our society that always kind of keep coming back and haunt America, because we continue to make bad choices. But I have to point out, it's not just America. It turns out people have been making bad choices since the beginning of time. It's
Yeah.
not just on America.
Hmm.
But once again, like, he could only arrest black people in
Right.
Muskogee as a
Once it
policeman. Now,
became
this
a
is not
state.
right. This
Yeah.
is not as the marshal. This is just for that last 2 years. So you kind of get like downgraded and whatever, but he's also 68 years old. I don't know if,
Yeah. He
he's
was a
still
bit
out
older.
kicking it. Yes.
Yeah.
And the last couple of months of his life, he didn't really work. They said that the sickness was kind of messing with him, but he ended up dying of kidney disease, or they called it,
Right.
what is it, Bright's disease or
Bright's
something?
disease, which
Bright's
is
disease.
basically any kind of kidney disease. Yeah.
It's like everybody got the tuberculosis, and whatever
Hmm.
all back then. It was just one of those things. But that's a long life and basically kicked ass the whole way through.
Yeah.
70 years, and yeah, you have a year of blight with that did eat up some of his fortune with the whole Cook thing.
Hmm.
And
Right. Right. He made enough that he was almost able to retire when he was in his 40s, but that whole Cook thing, he had to pay a lot of lawyers, and he had good lawyers, but
yeah, they said he hired like the best guy in the area. And
right.
so, but yeah, it ended up costing him. Now, he did remarry. His wife died of cancer.
Hmm.
Jenny, whatever. Jenny, whatever I said. I don't know.
Something Jenny. Yeah, I forget what his wives' names were. He had two of them.
Get to a Creek girl the second time.
Hmm.
Nellie Jenny was the first one, and she ended up dying of cancer. And then he remarried. The girl had 3 children already. Remarried a girl, and she was an Indian girl. I think she was I don't know. Anyway, so that's pretty much Bass Reeves. But the guy's basically a badass all the way through.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
lives his
and
life kind of on his terms. I mean,
yeah.
that's the whole thing. And that's really what sets you apart is, when you do things your own way and you get things done, and by your own way, I your own terms, I mean, you don't let fear rule your life. I don't
Hmm.
mean like screw society and I do my own thing. I mean, you do what you think is right and you do what
Right.
you believe. And
Hmm.
that's
Yeah, and
pretty
he was
awesome.
He was in at least 10 shootouts, and he didn't lose one of them.
Yeah, I heard so many different versions of how many people he had shot over the years and killed. Basically 11 to 14 were the reported, and who really knows? It's I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know what the reality is, because I heard so many stories that you know that contradict that. Oh, got another one for you. So one night, Bass Reeves is sleeping at the camp. He's got all his prisoners tied up. A skunk wanders into the camp, and the skunk ends up like climbing into his sleeping bag, or like snuggling up next to him. And sure enough, the prisoners see it, and they're like, oh, we're gonna get that skunk to spray him. So they're all hollering and yelling and trying to get the skunk all rattled and whatever. And Bass kind of wakes up and hears the commotion, looks at the skunk, gives it a pet, like kind of rubs it on the head, and the skunk just
Mhm.
gets up and walks away. So, again, not somebody startled easy. Um, they talked about like feats of strength. There was a story of a steer stuck in the mud, kind of sunk down. He went in and grabbed the horns and kind of wrestled it out and like helped pull it out of the mud. Which, if you ever gotten your equipment stuck in the mud, that
Yeah.
can be a bit of a challenge. You kind of get that whole suction thing going on, that makes it a little tough. So
Mhm.
he's kind of a badass. That's the bottom line. So yeah, I mean, it was funny because I'd never heard of this guy. And then I end up, checking this out and doing this deep dive like we do for a podcast. And pretty impressive. And I got to say, there were a lot more people that had heard of him, because there was a decent amount of information out there.
Mhm.
I know when I searched
Right.
out like Davy Crockett and we did things like that, there was a lot on Bass Reeves.
Mhm.
Even there was a comic book that came out later, that basically the Bass Reeves Frontier Marshal. You can still get them, the comic books. They're about $16, something like that. I'm sure they weren't 16 when they were new. Heritage, who make those cheap 22 long rifle pistols,
Mhm.
they actually made a Bass Reeves gun, and this gun is still, and it's basically got him engraved in the handle.
Right.
And they it's a 22 long rifle 6-shooter, but hey, I was like, maybe I need to pick one of those up. Those are pretty readily available at gunbroker.com for like 159. I was seeing them. So that's
Mhm.
something you might want to look into. But basically, all around, he was pretty much a badass. Ended up living his life, like I said, on his terms and doing his thing. And sounds like he made the world the way he wanted it to be. He was handed a load of crap in the beginning, being born a slave and into, ridiculousness. And he ended up making something pretty impressive out of himself. And that's awesome. And like
Mhm.
I said, when you live life by your terms and you dominate tons of other men, you're
Right.
kind of a badass.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
speaking of badass stuff, you may want to or badasses, you might want some badass gear. And you can find that at preppingbadass.com. You might have thoughts, things you want to hear about, learn about from the podcast. You can email us at preppingbadass@gmail.com. If there was any stories we missed or things you want to know about, you maybe put it in the comments. Um, Leave us a review if you're listening on, iTunes or Spotify, any of those great places. We always appreciate it. Help, spread the word. The big thing is, tell people about it. Tell them you enjoyed it. And if you're enjoying the podcast, share it around. Spread the love is what I would say.
Yeah.
Otherwise, yeah, you got something?
That's
We're
it.
good. All right. So with that, stay safe, and we will talk to you guys next week.